MBH.
In the latest in the Middle East crisis, there has been the Bashar al-Assad regime that has been taken over by the Syrian militants. While in Gaza, there is the Israeli strike that continues unabated. In the meantime, there has been a delicately struck ceasefire between the Hezbollah and Israel. And taking a look at United States of America, what has happened is that the Biden administration, just a few days after President Biden steps down from his presidency, has obviously opened a can of worms, whether it is Ukraine or you talk about Middle East and some other parts of the world. We'll discuss all this and more with my special guest who's joining me right now. I have with me Jason Isaacson. Jason Isaacson is the Chief Policy and Political Affairs Officer of the American Jewish Committee. Thank you, Jason, for joining me on the telecast.
I'm glad to be here, Megha. Thank you.
Of course, what has happened in the last 24 hours is something that comes as a shocker to the entire world. What do you make of the overthrowing of the 24-year-old Bashar al-Assad's regime by the Syrian militants?
Well, I think none of us will be missing Bashar al-Assad and the brutal regime that he ran, like his father before him, for so many decades. The question is what follows and what kind of a character we will see developing in a new leadership in Syria. The rebel forces that are a coalition of different kinds of groups, some with Turkish backing, some with Islamist roots, Al-Qaeda, ISIS. Not quite clear if there are any moderates among them, although some pretend to be moderate. It could be worse, frankly, for regional stability than the Assad regime was. We don't know yet. We're trying to figure that out right now. But at this point, the fact that a brutal dictatorship has gone is good news. The fact that Hezbollah, which had supported the Assad regime with the support of Iran, has been weakened, and therefore Iranian influence has been weakened, is good news. But sorting out the rest of the developments and the rest of the forces that are influencing the outcome of a future Syrian regime, it'll take some time to figure that out.
Do you think at this point of time, because Israel supports these the rebels as they are at this point of time spoken about or termed as in several pockets of the world, and including the Israelis, has been supportive, has been coming out in allowing for the overthrow of the government over there? Are you also wary that if you support one group over the other, there is another Islamist terrorist network that is once again being unleashed? I'm talking about the ISIS.
It's entirely possible, and I would be very careful about attributing any of the support that you see among rebel factions to Israel itself. There are certainly some feelings about certain of the groups that have made up this coalition that have now seized power in Syria that might have a more positive approach to the state of Israel. But by no means should one assume that that's the general feeling of this new coalition that has now taken power. We are just going to have to sort that out. From Israel's perspective, it has had a reasonably stable border with Syria since 1973. But of course, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has had bases in Syria. There have been missiles and drones fired into Israel from Syrian territory. Not necessarily the Syrian army, but from people who are operating within Syria, have posed a real security threat to Israel. Whether that kind of conduct will continue, I think we can account on the fact that Iran is no longer going to have that kind of influence in Syria. That's the way it looks right now. But as it develops, will there be other threats? If you have ISIS and Al-Qaeda groups on Israel's border, is that really better for Israel's security? That's what we're going to have to see.
Also, the president-elect of United States of America, Donald Trump, has come out and said this is not our war to get entangled into. Do you think Biden administration, President Biden, just few weeks ahead of him stepping down from the position, has utilized this, scorched earth policy, whether it is Ukraine and specifically in focus the Middle East and what has happened in Syria?
Yeah, look, I think it's an established fact that President Trump, when he was president and now President-elect Trump, has made it quite clear that he doesn't want to see American troops involved in the region, wants to see no wars, would like it to be over by the time he takes office. both in Gaza, in Lebanon, and now also in Syria. Whether that's a policy that can be maintained after January 20th, 2025, when he takes office, remains to be seen. One hopes that the United States will not have to be involved, rising to the defense of our allies in the region, rising to the defense of stability in the region. But the United States has a large footprint across the Middle East, and we will somehow be implicated in, frankly, however this turns out in Damascus.
Taking a look at the Gaza border, and there have been unprecedented Israeli strikes that have struck Gazans. I think yesterday itself there were reports there was several of the people who had died in yet another strike that had hit Gaza along the border. There have been a number of United Nations resolutions that have passed demanding Israel to ensure that there's ceasefire. Do you think there can be a solution that can be found to this so that there is end of war at last?
There can be. If the hostages are released and if no longer Hamas is in power, the Hamas terrorist organization is in power in Gaza, the war can end. The war could end tomorrow. Hamas could lay down its arms and release the hostages that it's been holding for 14 plus months. That's a simple equation. Whether you will see in the coming weeks or months the realization of the kind of ceasefire agreement that has been talked about with Egyptians and Qataris and the United States playing an important role in negotiations, one hopes that we'll actually get to that point. But Hamas is still posing a threat to Israel and is still holding hostages, 101, now it's 100 hostages, because we just identified one of them as having died. And the body has been recovered. Until that's over, Israel cannot tolerate having a terrorist army on its border, nor could it tolerate having a terrorist army on its northern border. And that's why it was so important that it eliminate or at least severely degrade the Hezbollah threat. But again, all of this traces back to Iran, an Iranian regime that has, since 1979, preached death to Israel and has armed and funded militias across the region attacking Israel. And now, of course, you saw in April and in October of this year, Iran directly attacking Israel. That problem cannot continue to be pushed down the road. It has to be confronted by the region, by the international community. Everyone is screaming about Israel's behavior in Gaza, where it's fighting a just war under the most difficult circumstances against an army that's embedded in a civilian population cynically, so that when it's attacked, in response to its attacks, civilians die, so it can claim propaganda victories because of that. It's intolerable. And I would think that India, as a country that itself has known terror and has had to fight terror for many years, sympathizes with, as we have seen from Prime Minister Modi, sympathizes with an Israeli government that has no choice but to go after these terrorists and to eliminate that once and for all, with as few civilian casualties as possible. But it's a terrible situation that we found ourselves in.
Also, before this war escalated to the position that we are currently in, there had been some effort towards normalization of ties between Israel and the Arab countries, and Saudi Arabia had to a certain extent become more moderate in its view towards Israel. But recently, during one of these Arab conferences that had happened, Saudi Arabia went about and made these categorically clear that it calls Israel a genocidal and an apartheid nation. Do you think there's more that needs to be done, and all the effort that had been put out to begin with will have to be revived once again? Like, have you go back to square one?
I don't think we have to go back to square one, and I'd be very careful about interpreting the different voices that one hears from Saudi Arabia, because I've also heard Saudi officials speak very clearly about their desire for a two-state solution, their desire to have a relationship with Israel, but wanting, of course, rights and justice for the Palestinians, wanting to see a Palestinian state down the road, but even a little bit unclear on the timing of the creation of that state, understanding the complexities of creating a Palestinian state alongside the state of Israel, but wanting it to move in that direction. By no means has Saudi Arabia lost its interest in normalizing with Israel. I've heard again and again from the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia, from the ambassador of Saudi Arabia to Washington at a conference a few months ago, and even more recently, I was at a conference over the weekend in the Gulf where, again, there were discussions about the possibility of normalization. That's the direction that the Saudis want to go and that Israel wants to go, and the United States, under whatever administration, wants to go as well. But certain things have to be put in place. There has to be an end to the current war. And we're moving in that direction. There has to be a political horizon for the Palestinians. Other than that, I see no reason why the logic of Israel's regional integration cannot continue to be fulfilled. As we saw in the Abraham Accords of 2020, the logic is there for the people of the region, for the Arab states to benefit from these relationships, from Israel to benefit, from regional stability to benefit from these relationships, and that'll continue.
Right, absolutely. And let's also talk about the Abraham Accords that was initiated,
Yes.
negotiated by President Trump in his first term when he came to power,
Yes.
2016. And now again, when President Trump has been elected, it's also very interesting to note that he has appointed the Middle East advisor who is very close to him, his family. And of course, we talk about Masad Bolus, who's
Yes.
the father-in-law of his younger daughter, Tiffany. Do you think situation could move forward? Because I don't know, especially during the war, this Abraham Accords had been put in the back burner. Do you think you see speed and progress in this regard after the Trump administration takes over?
I do see it. And also, let's not completely forget the credit that also belongs to the Biden administration, because frankly, over the last several years, they've kept the progress on track for an expansion of Arab-Israeli peace. They've tried very hard. President Biden has, with Jake Sullivan, with Antony Blinken, Brett McGurk, to advance the possibility of Saudi-Israeli normalization and a larger strategic framework for the United States in partnership with Israel and in partnership with the Gulf states. Under President-elect Trump and under then President Trump, of course, there will be a desire to expand the circle of Arab-Israeli peace. He's quite dedicated to that. It really is one of the great legacies of his first term. I do not anticipate any lessening of ambition to expand that circle. And yes, appointing the father-in-law of his youngest daughter, appointing a good friend, a golfing buddy as another Middle East advisor, appointments that he's made very early on in the first days after winning the election, of an ambassador to Israel, a very pro-Israel ambassador to the United Nations, a Middle East advisor, a second Middle East advisor, clearly demonstrates the ambition that the president-elect has to continue the progress that he made in 2020. And my organization, which has been involved in trying to open doors between Israelis and Arabs for decades, traveling across the region, introducing people to the concept that actually you'll help the Palestinian cause. If you have a relationship with Israel, you're not hurting the Palestinian cause. If you engage Israel, you can actually help move in the direction of a resolution of this Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and you also help your own societies. All of that logic we are seeing the fruits of over the last several years, even in the midst of war. The Abraham Accords have not broken. They are, you don't hear a lot about them these days because it's politically unpopular in Arab states to talk about a relationship with Israel. But those relations are not changed. There's an ambassador of Israel in Bahrain. There's an ambassador of Israel in Abu Dhabi, and vice versa. And business deals are still being made. We are doing whatever we can as a civil society organization to further encourage these kinds of connections, to build a foundation under the peace agreements that will exist now and that will continue to exist. So I'm very hopeful, although we've obviously been in a very difficult period since October 7th of last year.
Right, absolutely. And also talking about what is it that you expect of the Trump administration in Trump 2.2? Do you think there is going to be a difference in terms of the Israeli policy between President Biden and President Trump?
I think that there is a clear affinity between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, although they had some disagreement after he lost the election in 2020 about whether it was acceptable for Prime Minister Netanyahu to recognize the reality of President Biden's victory. But until that point, and frankly since then, they've also met since then as well, it's very clear that there's a solid personal relationship between the two, and frankly, a relationship of values and of ambitions. They both want to see peace in the region. They both want to see Israel's further integration into the region. And frankly, President Trump, you may remember, even before the Abraham Accords, was talking about the creation of a Palestinian state in his Peace to Prosperity plan of 2018, 2019. So I do expect that there will be a continued alignment of interests between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. But it's really an alignment between the United States and the State of Israel, countries that share values, that share common interests, and that really want stability in the region, and have worked together to enhance stability in the region.
Talking about, drawing parallels to the Ukraine-Russia war and what is happening in the Middle East, and particularly the war between Israel and Gaza. There have been time and again the sentiment echoed by Donald Trump, even when he was campaigning, was he is no longer going to waste the resources of United States of America in war and stop giving financial and military aid to Ukraine. In the meantime, Israel is also considerably dependent on the military aid that comes in from the United States of America. You think the same policy would be applied by the Trump administration for the Israelis in the Middle East war that Israel wages against all these groups?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that it's very clear that there is bipartisan support, quite deep bipartisan support, but very definitely in President Trump's party for continued military assistance to Israel, a sense that Israel in many ways is helping American security in the Middle East as a close ally, as a real partner. So I don't see that danger. I am concerned about the possibility of abandoning Ukraine, or at least weakening American support for Ukraine as it fights aggression by Russia. I'm hopeful that the bipartisan support that we've seen in Congress for continued military support for Ukraine will continue under the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, but that remains to be seen. The fact that President Zelensky met with President-elect Trump at Notre Dame just over the weekend, I hope is a good sign. I hope that that will also help persuade the president-elect that it's in the interest of the United States and our European allies to beat back against Russian aggression.
What do you expect and hope? Could there be at this point a permanent peace deal that could be negotiated between Ukraine and Russia, the war that has gone on for over 3 years? And do you think if pulling the plug by Trump, which means cutting out all sorts of assistance and aid, is then automatically going to leave Ukraine without any devices to fight the war?
That's a real concern. It's a real concern that if we talk about a negotiation to end the war in Ukraine, it generally sounds like appeasing Russian aggression. It generally sounds like saying, okay, the territory that Russia has seized in the eastern part of Ukraine is now going to be Russian, which is a reward for Russian aggression against a sovereign state on its border. And it should not be internationally acceptable. So I'm hopeful that if there is going to be a negotiation to end this war, it will not be on those terms. It will be on the terms that are acceptable to Ukraine as a sovereign state defending itself against an invading army. And rather than making this, step one in a long-term Russian strategy to recapture the glory of the Soviet Union by taking the countries that were part of the former Soviet Union and making them again part of some imperial Russia of the 21st century, unacceptable. I'm hoping that the Trump administration will make a very clear stand against that kind of historical mistake.
On one end, there have been numerous sanctions that have been imposed on Russia. On the other, several European countries continue to do business with the country. But there has been in the past pressure put on India as well when it decided to buy crude at discounted rates from Russia. Why do you think this is double standards and duplicity that is at play when it comes to the West and it dictating how the world functions?
If you're asking whether there is hypocrisy in the international community, I think the answer is a very clear yes. But one has to make certain judgments based on the needs of the day, the needs of the moment. I think that there has been really not a whole lot of criticism of India for buying Russian crude, and understanding that Israel has enormous energy needs and must, to develop its own economy and feed its own people, have energy, and that Russia is a ready supplier. And there are certain trade-offs that have to be made to accomplish all of these various ends, but pushing back against, punishing discouraging Russian aggression is a value that I hope the international community generally shares. But certainly allowances have to be made to make sure that people don't starve in the process.
Also, we are anticipating here in India the visit of the Russian President Vladimir Putin sometime in January. How is the world looking at this visit, especially when Prime Minister Narendra Modi had visited Russia, and of course he made later on in the month a visit to Ukraine as well. The world will be very strategically looking at what are going to be the outcomes of this meeting.
I'm sure that's the case. And I think there is a recognition in the United States that India, as a great and emerging, even greater power, has strategic autonomy and can make its own choices, its own decisions. But it's very clear from a Washington perspective that India and the United States have a great deal in common, a great deal they can do together. That includes security interests as well as economic interests and cultural interests. And if I had to redraw a map in a different way and make it possible for India not to have that kind of relationship, it would be, of course, a wonderful dream of mine. But the reality is that India does have a long-term historical relationship with Russia. I'm hoping that over time, you will see an even greater strengthening of the relationship between India and the United States, which is already on a very positive trajectory.
Talking about Trump's tariff policy, and particularly the statement that came in very aggressively, where he spoke about if there was an alternative currency system that was built by the BRICS nations, he is going to put 100% tariffs. Obviously, External Affairs Minister of our country, S. Jaishankar, has assuaged any of those concerns and spoken about there is not going to be anything on the table at this point of time. How do you react to it?
Look, I think President-elect Trump has a history of making very strong statements and trying to accomplish through heated rhetoric what can be most easily accomplished without having to actually take action. That if you kind of get people's attention, have people recognize the extent that you're prepared to go, maybe you don't have to go there. So I think it's all part of the way he operates as a famous deal maker in New York real estate. He's gotten a lot of great bargains because he's said the right thing at the right time.
Okay. Again, the question, are they going to be implemented? He's going to walk the talk.
Let's see how the BRICS countries respond.
Also, the 30% tariff on China. Now, there has been very categorical retort coming in from China that this needs to be reconsidered. Do you think this is going to work for America?
Look, if there really are high tariffs imposed on a country from which the United States imports a huge amount of goods and services, but mostly goods, there will be a price to be paid, and it'll be the consumers that pay a lot of those prices, and then there may be retaliation in which people will have to pay even more. Is there a way out of that? It may be that the United States will gain certain benefits from China on the trade front or perhaps on other fronts that will induce the president-elect to come up with a different strategy of how he's going to impose these tariffs. But holding out that big stick of big tariffs gives him certain leverage, and let's see how he uses it. And let's see how the world responds.
There are a lot of other European Union countries as well that have protested against these proposed tariffs.
And countries in the Americas as well. So we'll see. Yeah. I mean, Canada and Mexico especially.
Okay. Talking about India and Israel relations, what is the expectation? What is the hope? Obviously, we have been strong nations that have worked together. They're really people-to-people culture ties are fantastic. How are these relationships going to move further, and what direction is your expectation they're going towards?
Look, it's a tremendously exciting story. It's one of the great news stories of the last decades. The fact that for 22 years now? Hang on a second. It was almost 30, more than 30 years. Yeah. Excuse me. There is now full diplomatic relations. I guess it was in January of 1992. I remember it very well. That you've seen this upward trajectory of the relationship. In so many sectors, in people-to-people, cultural, business, education, all kinds of exchanges, Indian workers in Israel, Israelis setting up shop and investing in this country. It's very exciting. And also standing up for each other. As Prime Minister Modi recognized just hours after the attack of October 7th of 2023, the threat to Israel, and expressed his solidarity with Israel in a way that very few voices were heard around the world, certainly in the global south. He's been a staunch friend of the people of Israel, of the Jewish people, and of Prime Minister Netanyahu as well. But it's a people-to-people relationship that is so encouraging. And the fact that there is no history in this great country of anti-Semitism is something that every Jew who is conscious of international affairs understands. The relationship between American Jews and Indian Americans, which is frankly something that my organization, the American Jewish Committee, has been dedicated to for decades, this partnership with our fellow Americans in support of the U.S.-India relationship, but also in support of the India-Israel relationship, has been a factor. I have high ambition for this relationship continuing to flower between India and Israel, countries that are democratic, that have fought and have known terrorism and have survived, countries that are pluralistic, that have many peoples, many faiths within their systems. Frankly, it's just so obvious when you see Indians and Jews together how the chemistry is so strong. So I'm very excited about the continued growth of this relationship, and AJC will continue to be very much a part of that.
Absolutely. On that note, I come to the end of this discussion. Thank you so much, Jason, for talking
to me,
talking to us on News.
अरे ऋषि आज स्कूल नहीं गए?
3 महीने से फीस नहीं भर पाई।